Dr. Berembaum, you are one of the leading experts in matter of Holocaust, and you are also a rabbi. How do these two things intersect?
You've asked a very good question. How does being a rabbi intersect with being a Holocaust scholar? Sometimes it intersects by being in tension. By being in tension with each other. Secondly, I don't work as a rabbi for the most part. Okay. I work as a non-rabbi, and I work in the field of Holocaust studies. But part of what I do in the field of Holocaust studies is talk to both religious and interreligious groups. And I also do a good deal of work on some of the religious implications of the Holocaust and some of the events that happened some of the ways in which religious Jews went through the Holocaust and what they encountered. So I try to balance what I know about Judaism with what I know about the Holocaust. And sometimes I focus on the struggle of Jews to speak of God, to fight with God, to contend with God, to wrestle with God, to believe with God, but also to lose faith in God as a result of the Holocaust.
As a result?
As a result of the Holocaust.
Because many survivors are known not to believe in God anymore because of the famous question, where was God?
Well,
Do you have an answer?
I more often ask the question, where was humanity?
Okay.
And let me give you a little bit of an answer. God was not in the perpetrator. God was not in the killer. If anything, the killers were revolting against God. They were playing God. If God was to be found in the Holocaust, it was in the few instances in which there was rescue, in the few instances in which there were compassion, in the idea of people helping each other, people reaching out to each other, but not in the perpetrator. I refuse to accept that the Holocaust was punishment, and I refuse to accept, therefore, that Hitler was an instrumentality of God. Hitler was the anti-God, and the Nazis were the anti-God, who looked as if they were going to triumph in the world. And that's one of the things that all religious Jews have to struggle with in the aftermath of the Holocaust.
Because many people say, well, here in Mexico at least, that it was because the victims were more German than Jews.
Yes, but
this is too simplistic. No?
If they say that, then you have to ask the question, why was the most pious Jewish community in the world destroyed? The Jews of Eastern Europe, the Jews of Poland, the Hasidim of Satamare, of Bobov, all of the communities in which Jews lived pious and decent lives. Why wasn't the Holocaust taking place in America, which was far less religious? So that's too simplistic. Let's begin with a word of modesty. I am not God. I don't pretend to understand God. To understand God, I would have to be God. So I'm left with far more questions than I am with answers when I grapple with the Holocaust.
And what are most questions that they ask you?
The question in part is, where was God? The question in part is, how do you believe in God who intervenes in history when God didn't intervene in history? How do you believe in the God who saves when God did not save? How could you regard this as punishment when that would say that Hitler was God's instrument and God should be a better pedagogue than to be able to punish the people by killing 1.5 million Jewish children? Therefore, I don't want to deal with that part of it that presumes that the killer was the instrumentality of God. Rescue was the instrumentality of God. Healing in the aftermath of the Holocaust is the way in which God's presence is manifest.
Now, how do you get to be an expert in the Holocaust when you are a rabbi? It is like contradictory a bit?
No. I went on and did a PhD in Holocaust studies after I finished my rabbinical training. So I have both training. It's the equivalent of how do you master any field? You work at it. You study, you learn, and you attempt to get better and learn.
How long did you study and master in this fact that is quite recent?
Well, let's begin. When I was growing up, we didn't discuss the Holocaust. It was in silence.
It was?
It was in silence. We didn't speak of the Holocaust. Later on, I began to study the Holocaust, and I haven't stopped studying since. So in essence, I've studied the Holocaust for the past 41 years. Actually, no, I'm sorry. For the past 51 years, from college onward, I have been wrestling with trying to understand the Holocaust.
And did you understand?
I can tell you how it happened. I can tell you how the Jews responded. I can tell you how the nations of the world behaved. I cannot fully tell you why it happened. And I wrestle with the question, what do we learn to learn from it? Which is a different set of questions.
There is election after the Holocaust?
There's what?
Election?
Election?
Something we can learn?
Oh, there are many things we can learn after the Holocaust. One of the things we can learn is we can't be indifferent to the suffering of others. That if people come to you in need, you have to help. We can't be indifferent. One of the other lessons that the Jewish people has learned, we can't be powerless.
Okay.
Powerlessness invites victimization. Another one of the lessons is that we have to be prepared to fight evil and grapple with evil when it begins, not already when it's expanded and exploded.
Do you think Israel has learned from the Holocaust?
Yes, Israel has learned a considerable amount from the Holocaust. Sometimes it's learned a little bit too much.
Why?
Well, sometimes Israel begins to see itself as if the Holocaust hasn't ended.
Okay.
And the Holocaust has ended. The people who are against Israel today are not Adolf Hitler. That doesn't make them nice guys. But Hitler ruled over 21 countries, had the most powerful army in the world. He was totally and completely ruthless and fully dedicated to destroying the Jewish people. None of Israel's opponents have that power. None of Israel's opponents have that influence. None of Israel's opponents have quite that determination, and none of them can affect it in the same way. So I think it would be a mistake to learn from the Holocaust that we still face the same problems. We are a different people and the world is a different place. So that's what I mean by Israel has sometimes learned a little bit too much.
So you are optimistic, but let's say...
No, I would put it to you this way. I'm an optimist against my better judgment.
And
which are the words that Abraham Joshua Heschel once said. I'm an optimist against my better judgment. I refuse to yield to despair, and I refuse to allow despair to say it can't be done. We have to do better.
We have to do better.
We have to do better.
How to do better?
How to do better? Learning, education, dedication, and commitment.
Prime Minister Netanyahu this year made a special speech about the similarities between the time of the Holocaust and the circumstances today.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I think he doesn't understand the Holocaust, and therefore he doesn't understand today. He was less convincing on that than many other things that he said. Anybody who, for example, says a withdrawal to the borders of 1967 is a withdrawal to the borders of Auschwitz doesn't understand that Jews had no tanks at Auschwitz, they had no planes, they had no troops, they had no missiles, they had no ability to defend themselves. How can you compare the two? Even if you take Ahmadinejad, who wished the Jewish people no good and would have liked to destroy the Jewish people, he had no power in comparison to Adolf Hitler. So the fact that he hates us is not equivalent to the hatred of Adolf Hitler. This is not, I believe, this is not 1933, it's not 1939, it's not 1942. And when the Prime Minister of Israel says that, he doesn't understand the Holocaust.
But he makes people feel victimization.
Well, but Jews are not only victims today. Jews have power and they have the ability to control their own fate. That's the great achievement of Israel. The great achievement of Israel is we don't have to be victims.
Sure, a little bit what you said about the lessons of the Holocaust.
That's right.
And you have designed many Holocaust museums. What is the main idea in a Holocaust museum?
The main idea of any museum that I work with is the museum tells a story.
Okay.
And that is that we have the instrumentalities for telling a story today. The way we tell a story today, we tell a story in novels.
Uh-huh.
We tell a story in television, we tell a story in movies, and we tell a story in museums. What's the difference between a movie and a museum? A movie has moving imagery and a captive audience. You sit down in the movie theater and you sit there. And then you look at the screen and the director can do whatever he wants to do with you. In a museum you have a moving audience and captive imagery. Meaning you have an audience that moves but the imagery remains in place. But the story can become the instrumentality driving the narrative. And because it drives the narrative, that means you use all of the modalities of telling a story within a museum. Artifacts and art, music, and above all testimony. And we have the capacity today to use survivor testimony. And we're at a privileged moment in history. We are the last generation to live in the presence of the survivor, and the first generation to live at a distance of the Holocaust so we can understand and gain perspective. And part of what we do in museums is try to do both.
And in the last times, every day, there is a new discovery about the Holocaust. And the press seems set on this subject, like the Spanish press. Every day there is something. The sheets of Hitler, the friend of Hitler, the assistant of Hitler. Every day there is something different.
Look, I work all day. I work many nights, and I can't stay even with my field because the field is developing. So much more is being learned every day. And again, as information is being declassified, as people are dying and leaving behind material, the field of Holocaust studies continues to grow and expand. And part of what we struggle to do is to work very hard to keep even.
And what is the most impressive in your opinion, the most impressive news or discoveries about the Holocaust?
You don't have an hour.
Huh?
You don't have an hour, but I'll tell you 3 very simple examples. In recent years, they have dug up some of the mass graves in Eastern Europe. When they dug up mass graves in Eastern Europe, they discovered several things that tell you something that we didn't know before. They discovered bullets.
Okay.
Bullets are forensic information. They tell you who was the killer. Was the killer the Wehrmacht, the German army? Was the killer the SS? Was the killer local gendarmerie? Was it troops, for example, from Romania, from Hungary? Or was it local people who were killing their own? We also discovered that many bodies had no bullet holes. So it means that a husband stepped in front of a bullet for his wife, that a father stepped in front of a bullet for a daughter, for a son, a mother protected her child, a grandparent, a grandchild. We also discovered something else. We discovered keys. Now, you don't think of keys as historical information, but keys tell you a very interesting story. What does a key represent? A key represents that when I left home this morning, I locked my door and I expect my home to be there when I come home. When I parked my car 20 minutes ago, I expect my car to be there when I come out. It represents safety and it represents predictability. So the fact that people died with keys in their pockets meant they didn't think they were going to their death. They thought they were leaving home to return. And that tells you a good deal about how they thought of their own experience.